Cheryl Gloetfelty, who's considered as the pioneer. She was then a student and then went on to become a professor. And she wrote in the Eco-Criticism Reader, I'll quote her, "Eco-criticism is the study of the relationship between literature and the physical environment." Peter Barry, in his book, Beginning Theory, I quote him, "For the eco-critic, nature really exists out there beyond us, not needing to be ironized as a concept by enclosure within inverted commas, but actually present as an entity which affects us and which can affect perhaps fatally if we mistreat it." So, unquote. So, eco-criticism has been considered as a study of the relationship between literature and the environment, which is conducted in a spirit of commitment to environmental praxis. And when you look at how eco-criticism has grown, we look at it as two waves. The first wave of eco-critics, they focused on nature writing, on nature poetry and wilderness fiction. And they were trying to uphold the philosophy of organism. The aim was to preserve biotic community. And eco-criticism has always aimed at earth care. Eco-criticism is a new branch of literary criticism. And you know that it is aimed at relating to ecological literacy and prompts the writer to raise these issues in his creative work. In India, before I come to India, let me just talk about what S. William Meeker has to say. He uses a term called literary ecology. I quote, "Ecology is an ancient theme in art and literature," unquote. But the theme has been ancient and has been present in the religious scriptures of all religions in India, whether it's Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, also in Islam and Christianity. So the two waves that we can broadly identify are the first wave, agricultural civilization, the wave of ecology in the religious scriptures is noticed. I'm now talking about India. Agricultural civilization, we've had that, and the wave of ecology that there is in the religious scriptures, and we have noticed that. We will come to detailing that in the course of the talk. The second wave corresponds with the Industrial Revolution and is reflected in the Indian Renaissance literature, influenced by Romanticism and Transcendentalism. So you've got Tagore, Sarojini Naidu, Aurobindo Ghosh, Harendranath Chattopadhyay in the first half of the 20th century. The third wave of Indian eco-criticism takes place around the 1980s, when the courses and the syllabuses in the departments of literatures begin to teach these courses. So, for example, a course in Tamil poetics was added in the South in the 1980s. Aurobindo's poetics was added in many of the courses, shifting the focus on Indian aesthetics. And this was beginning to happen in many of the universities and in the academia across the country. And eco-criticism in its present and modern sense in India eventually came to be as part of our critical studies and is there in most universities. I would like to begin talking about, well, let me see how I would like to talk about this. So let me begin with a quote. And the quote is from the Atharva Veda. And I'm not going to quote in Sanskrit because then you spend time trying to translate it. I don't want to impress you with my knowledge of Sanskrit, which I do have because I have done my course, full course, and done an exam in Sanskrit. So to begin with, the Atharva Veda says, "O Mother Earth, born of you and living with you, we all creatures." Unquote. So all the four Vedas, whether it's the Rig Veda or the Sam Veda or the Atharva or the Yajur Veda, the oldest works belonging to that of the oral traditions, we find ecological prosperity as nature worship, or pantheism, which was prevailing in those times. Planet Earth was called Mother. The elements of nature, earth, water, air, fire, and sky were worshipped. They were worshipped as powerful gods and goddesses. Even trees are called Vriksha Devata. And the Rig Veda extols the virtues of trees and plants in our homes as having medicinal and curative properties. And we worship them, whether it's the Tulsi tree or you talk of the other trees, the 5 trees that we are not supposed to cut and remove. You do know that now that these are trees. The peepal tree, for example, is important because of the quantity of oxygen that it gives out. Typically, you can prove it now, but in terms of an understanding that these trees were important and that the environment was important, we were, in our tradition, worshipping them as visible manifestations of divinity. For example, let me quote, Vanaspatim Van Ashtapyadhvam Nisudaditvam Akanant Atsam, meaning it is in the interest of mankind to plant more and more trees as these safeguard the water resources. But their origin can be traced long back in the Vedic and ancient Sanskrit literature. The most significant role in the purification of the environment. And the seers of the Rig Veda classify birds and animals as sky animals like birds, forest animals and their habitation, and there is animals in human habitation. So there is always this distinction of what space belongs to which kind of animal. And there is a general feeling in the Vedic texts that animals should be kept safe, they should be protected and healthy. So protection of birds and animals is a norm in the Indian thought and also in Hindu religion. About 3,000 years ago, the sages recited verses regarding this, and I'd like to quote the English version for a better understanding. I quote, "Let there be balance in space. Let there be balance in the sky. Let there be peace on earth. Let there be balance. Let there be calmness. Let there be. Let there be growth in the plants. Let there be growth in the trees. Let there be grace in the gods. Let there be bliss in the Brahman. Let there be balance in everything. Let there be peace and peace. Let such peace be with everyone." Unquote. Understand what the sages were trying to say, and if you really go back to them, you would know what it means, and we have begun to realize now to read more and to go back. Even in the Holy Quran, Ard is a word which means the earth. And the word is used at least 485 times. The Islamic law, the Sharia, which means the source of water. Sharia literally means the source of water. It is the source of life. So the Sharia is the source of life. And in Islam, conservation of the environment is based on the principle that all individual components of the environment are created by God, and that all living things are created by the Almighty Creator. And these components of the natural environment serve humanity. But that does not mean that their utility to humanity is the only function or the sole reason. A scholar of medieval times, Ibn Taymiyyah, has explained that in these verses in the Quran, the benefits of these creatures to man is of course there. But it is also believed in Islam that these components of nature constantly praise God. This praise is prevented if man destroys nature. So there is a reward for charity shown to each creature with a heart that is flowing with love. So the protection of certain zones is the concept of Hima, which is included in the Islamic law. It is a practice which is still followed in Islamic countries. Nature is a magnificent gift of Allah, and therefore nature is made for love, peace, and mercy, and must be treated with respect and justice. If we come to the Bible, this is section 2, Adam and Eve were given in the beginning the dominion over all animals and plants in the Garden of Eden or earth. That is the world. The Christian worldview is thus anthropocentric. The earth is here to serve man, and man is here to serve God. So Christianity, according to Lynn White, is the most anthropocentric as man shares God's transcendence of nature. And Christianity rejects the notion of animism, which demystifies nature. And because of this, it strips it of its intrinsic value. So Christianity has established a dualism of man and nature, but it insists that it is God's will that man exploit nature for his proper ends. Abusing the environment therefore becomes a sin, as it is a direct rejection of the promise of God. If we go to Buddhism, Buddhism preaches the way of loving kindness and compassion. All beings in the universe are equal, and in nature, all are equal, and their lives are interrelated, mutually developing, and inseparable. Buddhist as well as Jain monasteries are established in the deep recesses of the forests and manifest the harmonious union of man and nature. The monasteries and temples in the mountains and the forests allow them to live in peace and noble tranquility. Tolerance has made the followers of Buddhism and Jainism to follow the path of non-violence and to adhere to this doctrine along with non-attachment. If you look at the Shri Guru Granth Sahib Ji, the material world and man, they share an interrelationship, reciprocally conditioning the life of each other. Guru Nanak Ji, in his composition, Japa Ji, stresses on this. I quote the English version from the Guru Granth Sahib Ji, section 8. Air is a vital force, water the progenitor. The vast earth is the mother of all. Days and nights are nurses, fondling all creation in their lap. Unquote. So Sikh, they too believe that the material world and its phenomena, that is nature, like all creation, is a manifestation of God. And God is within each element of creation. In addition to these, there are tribal religions and in India, and they worship the forces of nature. So they worship the trees and flowers, animals and mountains, and they do that devoutly so. They are all for conservation of nature. And their folk songs, folk tales, their legends, their dances have the foundations of ecology. And this is the first wave of ecological perspectives and eco-criticism that prevailed in ancient times in India. All religions have, in their texts, advocated this balance between man and nature. This is a living practice already established in India. Indian philosophers distinguish themselves by their spiritual philosophy. In the Rig Veda, the entire world is taken as a family. All the religious cults are free to flourish. In fact, earth is the mother of all mothers, and sky the biggest protector, the father of all fathers. The earth mother nourishes, and the sky father protects. The Matsya Puran tells us that to plant one tree and extend personal carings to it is equal to 10 suns. This is one of the greatest eco-philosophies of all time. And it exists there in the Matsya Puran, where they say that if you plant one tree, it's as good as having 10 sons or having looked after 10 sons. In the Skanda Puran, Parvati, the wife of Shiva, adopts a sapling of the Ashoka. The Ashoka tree, you know that? Parvati adopts a sapling of Ashoka as a baby. And then she insists on getting all the sanskars, all the rituals performed by the sages that you would for a newborn child. All the prayers, everything, all the offerings, everything for the well-being of the child, she does and goes forth with it for this one Ashoka sapling that she's adopted as a child. In the Ramayana, if you look at the Balkand, Valmiki was grief-stricken at the sight of the conch bird, which was killed by some hunter. And Valmiki was so agitated and angry that he cursed the hunter that he would lose his peace of mind simply because he had killed that bird. If we now go into looking at picking up some of the, so this was what is there in your Purans and what is there in, I will come more and talk more elaborately about the Ramayana a little later in my talk. But if we look at, let us see, if we look at Kalidas. Now, he is often placed in the 4th century AD. He's considered to be a great Sanskrit dramatist, also considered in world literature. He's considered amongst the greatest of all poets. He would rank amongst the first 3. And if you look at his work, Abhigyan Shakuntalam, in his very opening statement of the play, he identifies 8 divine visible manifestations of God. And these are serially water, fire, the priest, one who performs rituals, anyone, not a Brahmin, anyone performing rituals, the priest, the sun, the moon, the sky, earth, and air. And these, according to him, manifestations are to be venerated and protected. In Act 1, around the 48th statement, Shakuntala is talking to Anusuya. And she's declaring that the trees of the ashram are her own brothers and sisters. If you look at Act 4, verse 9, Karnava, the foster father of Shakuntala, he has to let Shakuntala go to her husband's place. And so before allowing her to proceed to her husband's place, he takes permission of all the elements of nature that are associated with her. And he says to the trees, I quote the English version, "She who would never think of drinking water before she has irrigated you, who would not pluck a leaf out of affection, even though she likes to adorn herself, she who used to celebrate the first appearance of flowers, she may be allowed to proceed to her husband's place," unquote. He takes permission. And it is because of this innumerable such references that this play is considered to be one of the best world eco texts. Kalidas's advocacy for the growth and preservation of flora and fauna is also seen in his other works, whether you look at Meghaduta or you look at Raghuvansha. Specifically, I would like to refer to his work Ritu Sanhar. Every stanza of poetry, the 6 seasons are represented through the eyes of a lover. And what are the 6 seasons? Grishma, summer, Varsha. I hope all of you follow these words. Varsha would be the rains. Sharad is winter. Hemant, Shishir, and Vasanta. So, of the 144 stanzas, virtually every stanza talks about the changing seasons and through the lover's eyes. I'd like to quote one such para for you. I quote, "Dotting the woodlands are charming glades besides streams, haunted by timorous gazelles, easily alarmed, tremulous eyes, like deep blue water, lilies enchant, and the heart is twisted with sudden longing." Nature is absolutely imbued with the emotion that the lover feels. So Sanskrit literature is replete with eco-contexts and concerns, because Sanskrit creative writers have been ever friendly with nature and ecology. And they knew how to live in harmony. And they knew how to express it in their creative works. This notion to live in harmony with the ecosystem is relatively recent and novel for the Western scholarship. But it is quite ancient and old to Eastern scholarship. And therefore, there is a need to understand our attitude to the environment. So for those of us who exult and say, oh, I'm doing an eco-critical study, I'm doing eco-criticism, there's a kind of a snobbery that we suddenly jump into as, in the academia in India, specifically in the English literature department, as if eco-criticism is something that has just popped up. And please understand and believe very clearly that it's very novel, very recent for the Western mind, but for the ancient and old and Eastern scholarship, that's not so. An N number of Western critics, if Indian critics do not impress you, read Western critics and what they have to say. They are the ones who considered some of our Sanskrit texts to be the most exhaustive and most brilliant eco-texts that there could ever be. And there is a need to understand our attitude to the environment in juxtaposition to the classical Indian scriptures, which illustrates the ecological approach of our society towards nature and its beauty. Now, if you look at Indian classics, such as the Upanishads, Murali Sivakrishnan in about 2017 writes, critiques and writes that, and he affirms that the Upanishads have an abundance of ecological consciousness. I'm quoting him, quote, abundance of ecological consciousness which encode a pan-Indian vision of the aesthetic dimensions of the environment, unquote. So having analyzed the historical fact, he continues to say that throughout the history, people continually have tried to reconstruct nature and the environment, which has molded our attitude towards nature accordingly. And he suggests that we have to look into the way our perception of nature has been transformed. We have to also figure out when and where human beings have completely been identified with the non-human world. For this, he advises, and I believe too, that we have to dig into classical Indian literature, especially Sanskrit literature, and such literature also illustrates where environmental ethics can step in. So at this juncture, I would like to share with you that I've been invited for a talk to give a lecture in Florida State University on Indian aesthetics. And at that point of time, I met some professors from across the country, across America, who were professors of Sanskrit, but there were a number of professors, and one particular professor in Florida itself had published a big, thick tome in which he had translated and analyzed some of our Sanskrit texts. Now, if we look at our own departments of English, can you imagine that if we were to put forth a translation work of some Sanskrit text or a study of some Sanskrit text, you would possibly be told that, this is meant for Sanskrit departments, or not meant for you to do. But it is about time that we as teachers begin to think that in collaboration with teachers, we can collaboratively research with teachers from departments of Sanskrit, pick up texts which are relevant, even if you're looking at them through prisms or looking at them through frameworks which are Western. You can look at what is unique there and what has been there for many, 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 many years. And, that there is reason for us to bring it out and bring it forth and express it and to write it. And why is it that in English departments, we are not allowing the teachers to research on texts from other languages and write an analysis in English? Why can't we? So it's about time that you people and young people will begin to push for this and make sure that whether it is translation or it's interpretation or reading of a text in Tamil or Telugu or, Kannada or in Sanskrit or one of our Veds or one of our other texts, what happens? We are constantly told in these meetings, I've tried it earlier, tell us the texts. Are they available in English? Well, it doesn't matter if they're not available in English. If the person who's doing the research can read Awadhi, can read Bhojpuri, can read Tamil, can read Kannada, knows the language, can read Sanskrit, what's the problem? Why can they not work in collaboration? Why can they not be allowed to read those texts in the languages in which they exist, because ultimately the thesis or the PhD will be presented in English. So how is it that we can go about it? So this whole idea of cultural studies, where you can put this under the umbrella of cultural studies and begin to look at translation studies and look at it as a very important emerging area for research. So the scholars of environmental studies, they largely agree to the contention that Asian religions have the potential to counter the notions of anthropocentrism. What the problem that we are facing in the world today is because of the Christian belief that nature is meant for man. And therefore, even in India, we gave up our own original way of, living and thinking. A lot of young people and many people in my generation do not understand the entire notion of why Tulsi should be worshipped. Well, Tulsi worship could have been put into place because it has medicinal and curative properties. That you needed to grow more and more of these plants because they were good for your health. And how do you make a large mass of people do this? By just saying that it is sacred, worship it. The minute you say it's sacred, people begin to worship it. Worship means to nurture it, look after it, and care for it. So for us, it is about time that we understood that as an Asian nation and as a religion which is, Asian in origin, it has been already accepted by the Western world that an environmentalist, that Asian religions have the potential to counter this anthropocentric attitude that the West has. And in his work, The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, L. White in 1967 identifies religions, particularly Christianity, as a major source of anthropocentric dominion. And he very clearly said that it is because of the beliefs of what Christianity has propagated that the ecological crisis has come, because we've become more and more anthropocentric, using breaking up the natural system, the ecology, to suit ourselves and to suit our purpose, for money, for growth, for development. And he also goes forth and says that Hinduism in particular is one among the various Asian traditions which is considered as an important source of a world sacralizing vision that posits humanity closer to nature. Lance Nelson, in about 212, in his Brill's, he wrote this Brill's Encyclopedia on Hinduism. And in that he says that in ancient Sanskrit texts, particularly courtly poetry and drama, there are numerous passages that manifest aesthetic awareness of natural phenomena. Now here, I would like to say that this is a vast, unexplored area for research by departments of English in the Indian universities. Sanskrit texts are being studied abroad, they are being translated, they are being looked at for the aesthetics. There's a huge interest in the Indian aesthetic theory. There's a huge interest in the Indian worldview, and therefore, for us as teachers of literature, English literature, we can use the language that we know, which is the language which the world understands, to talk about what is ours and what has been ours for thousands and thousands of years. In 2014, Malcolm Miles wrote a work called Eco-Aesthetics, Art, Literature and Architecture in a Period of Climate Change. And in that he writes, and I quote, "Seeing the world as mere object implies its exploitation. Seeing it or feeling it as a mirror of the self, which is more or less an ecological position, may imply a sense of caring and living in relation to, rather than exerting power over the world," unquote. So in the Upanishads, it has also been said that the self is the world of all beings. The self is the world of all beings. All beings, whether it's grass or nature or land or animal, their self. And Brahman, not Brahma, Brahman, is the self in each of us. In fact, as long as one wishes non-injury and safety for his own world, so far all beings wish for non-injury for him. So if you wish that you don't get destroyed, the other also wishes that they will not get destroyed. This in fact is well known and is examined by S. Radhakrishnan and others in the Principal Upanishads. And the reliance over other beings and interdependence of each living being is important, and among the various entities of ecology has been brought out as said in the 5th Brahman of Brihadaranyaka. The Brihadaranyaka talks about this interdependence, or that we live with one another, for one another, along with one another. The Upanishad says, and I quote, "The earth and all living things are mutually dependent, even as bees and honey are. The bees make honey and honey supports the bees." So this, in the Principal Upanishad, 172 section, there is a very beautiful line which says, "Parasparam upkarak bhave phalitam aham." If we are mutually of use, एक दूसरे का उपकार कर सकते हैं, वही हम लोगों के लिए फल देगा. So that the earth and all living things are dependent. Bees, honey, everything. It supports the bees. If the bees make the honey supports the bees. And therefore here comes the notion of deep ecology. So deep ecology proposes that there should be a shift from anthropocentrism to ecocentrism. That is, ecology at the center, which once existed in our part of the world. And after having given you this kind of a background, I would now like to take you into a slightly more detailed analysis of how the world is perceived and how our, the late Vedic period grew and how it came. Let me come to the Hindu tradition. So the Hindu tradition boasts the knowledge of a very complex cosmology. For example, we say the earth is like a disk and there is a sacred Mount Meru in the center. And then the 4 continents surrounded by the oceans. And they extend along the 4 cardinal points. And this mythical continent is called the Jambudvipa. We've all heard of the Jambudvipa. And from sacred texts, the concept of the Jambudvipa filters into indigenous folklore and to other cosmogonies of various places in the mainland of India and the Himalayas. So this idea regarding the structure of the subcontinent, it conforms, it ends up conforming as a single bounded geographical entity, the Jambudvipa, in which the concept of the development of Indian space takes place in particular through animal and vegetable forms. Jambudvip में जो पेड़ पौधे जानवर पशु पक्षी और मनुष्य रहते हैं, they are all equal and an integral part of what we call the Jambudvipa. So the importance of the mountain, the Meru, the center, the sacred mountain. आप जो Buddhists हैं, they also talk of the Meru Parvat, जिसके ऊपर Buddha is to be found and where everybody gathers for prayer. So the importance of the mountain in recalling the center of the world should be mentioned. Meru has a very clear axial symbolism. The mountain communicates with the 3 worlds, but it is itself covered. The mountain is covered. It is inhabited by all kinds of humans, non-humans, trees, animals, divinities, spirits and demons. So आगे अगर आप देखेंगे geographically, the cavern is intended as a natural underground chamber in a mountain or a hillside or a cliff. But it is characterized by a very strong religious symbolism. The cave is like a womb of Mother Earth. The cave is a prelude to a metaphorical journey of death or catabasis and rebirth from the bowels of the earth. So in a spiritual sense, this symbolism is being transposed into each of the thousands of temples dotting the geography of India. And each of them have these rising towers. Look at the temples. The temples have a shikhar. They recall the sacred mountains. And then they contain the sanctum sanctorum or the garbhagriha. So on the top, you have the shikhar of the temple, and then you have the garbhagriha, which literally is like a womb, the interior, which contains within it the embryo within them. So when we look at Jambu Dvipa, it's literally the land, the dweep of the Jambu. You know what is Jambu? It is the rose apple tree, which is called Syzygium cumini. So the rose apple tree, the word Jambu actually means that. Dweep means the land where this rose apple tree grows. Now here evidently is a symbol of sweetness and abundance, because the rose apple tree's fruit is the juiciest and the sweetest of all. At the same time, the richness of the Aryavarta is evidenced a large number of wild animals called mriga, a term that often is in subsequent literature refers to antelopes. But in India, there is a tendency to backdate these conceptions to the mists of time. We don't want to accept that they existed. We say, oh, these are ancient, as these are notions considered relevant to religious tradition. You immediately join it to Hindu religion and forget about the fact that the geography of the country, the idea and the thought itself, had nothing to do with religion. So it must be observed that the Vedas and the very first Sanskrit literature do not mention the Jambu Dweep. They do not mention the Jambu Dweep. And this has been researched as late as 2017 by Ray, and he says that no mention is made of it, even in the systematization of the Sanskrit grammar or Panini. It appears rather in the Buddhist canons and in the Arthashastra, and then widely in the Puranic literature. So it is still plausible that a reminiscence of a once agro-pastoral civilization reverberates through the positive perception of an ancestral wealth of a hunting and gathering territory. So as for reasons of space, we need to stop here in the awareness that Buddhist environmental ethics and the related understanding of ecosystems is a truly complex issue when you look at it from an exegetical point of view. And the same goes for the first Hindu cosmologies. It seems interesting to observe that the concept of the antithetical principles of the domesticated and the wild, the tamed and untamed, which has been discussed by Levi Strauss in Anthropology, can also be found in a nutshell in ancient literature. The ancient Indians divided the land into the village, the gram, and wild, the mriga. Now this kind of line geographically demarcating beings and their environment unfolds a very complex normative categorization of relationships and interactions, social hierarchies, dietary norms that see prey and predators, carnivores and herbivores, courtyard and forest animals opposing each other. So a great abundance of references can be traced from the cosmogonies of the Vedic hymn of the Purusha Sukta in the Rig Veda to the tales of the Panchatantra, of which the oldest redactions date back to the 1st century AD. Yet, between the wild and the domesticated, there is not only opposition, but also a certain correspondence. Some elements of the former fall into the latter and vice versa. A lot of the wild are domesticated and some which are domesticated turn wild. The village, the city, the sacred space in which we call it, in Sanskrit we call it Kshetra, meaning the field. When it exhausts its sacredness, recursively it returns to draw it from the depths of the forest. So the images of the gods, the sacredness of the relics, the updating of the doctrinal issues seem to reside in the ancestral nature of the woods surrounding the human dimension. The cities and the villages were always surrounded by jungle. There were always the woods around. There was always a demarcation between the wild and the domesticated. So we have to understand that if the ancient inhabitants of India classified the woodlands, how did they classify it? So they classified it as marshes. The marshes, they called it anupa, which were unhealthy, unstable places, not suitable for construction of settlements. And then they would create, they had the scrub, the dry scrub forest, which they called jungle. So the marshes were called anupa and the scrub forests were called jungle, which could be cleaned to make room for villages and crops. There was also the concept of a sacred, ancestral and inviolable forest land, which was called Aranya. That symbolized the purity of the territory. So the Indian jungle is therefore not just one random jungle. We had identified three distinct kinds of things which existed within the jungle. The anupa, which were the marshes, there was the scrub forest, the jungle, and then the inviolable ancestral forest land called the Aranya, which symbolizes purity of the territory. So the Indian forest or the Indian jungle becomes a dark, mysterious place, potentially dangerous due to the presence of predators and evil spirits, but also for the layman, the profane and uninitiated, who cannot interpret its sacredness. Fisher, I'll quote Fisher for you. Fisher, and I quote, "Forests were also sites of sacred power, where religious explorers in the optional third ashrama renounced society to form an ashram, a sylvan hermitage or retreat, and experiment with powerful but potentially dangerous ideas and practices. There, thinkers and philosophers considered the nature of Atman, the self, and relationship with Brahman, the universe, as an undifferentiated unity. So the Atma and the Brahman were one, undifferentiated. So we are exploring the connection. Producing the Sanskrit Aranyakas. Aranyakas are called forest books, Upanishads, called the esoteric books. These texts, which most scholars date back to 900 to 500 BC, later were labeled Vedanta, or the end, culmination, or the goal of the Vedanta, the end, culmination, or goal of the Vedas, unquote. So even Western philosophers, Western critics who are looking into it are having and developing an understanding of how things existed. Why is it that we as professors of literature and English are not bothered to even explore and to have an understanding I think all teachers of English literature should definitely go on and do some online courses to have an understanding of, your own, what are the Vedas, what are the Upanishads, how many are there. You have to have a basic understanding, because when you travel abroad now as scholars, one of the first things that they expect of you and expect you to be able to talk about are your own Vedas and the Purans and the Vedas, and you know nothing about it because we haven't bothered to read it to find out. So when we talk of reskilling, upskilling ourselves, this is one area in which you people need to be going forward. At least do some online courses. There's some fantastic one-week courses which give you everything briefly. That could be a point to begin. I would now like to bring you to the Ramayana, which was one of the two most famous epics of Indian literature and one of the oldest treatises. It's the oldest piece on botany of the subcontinent. And this has been said by Lee, a critic, in as late as 2000. And the dating of the poem's original core is still unknown, and some scholars are inclined to place it between the 7th and 4th century BC, while its completion is ascribed to not known later than 3rd century BC. However, the saga of Ram and his companions, it boasts of countless versions and regional reinterpretations. The original narration of the myth and the mythical events is attributed to the poet Valmiki, you know that, who has, through his elegant stanzas, refined and erudite style, he managed to intertwine together, through the admirable deeds of the heroes, a kind of a piece on geography, a saga in which today many scholars distinguish historical elements and finally a delicate account of a forest ecosystem. The forest is in fact the constant background of the plot of the Ramayana, and above all has a variable feature that seems to influence the inclinations and moods of the characters, as if there was a sort of a human, non-human plant empathy going on. Depending on whether this is an idyllic, pleasant, or rather harsh, wild place, inhabitants, whether it's inhabited by saints or ascetics or animals or demons, the mood of that area is determined. So the forest has many characteristics that are well suited to the human soul. It can be calm, like Shanta. It could be sweet, Madhur. It could be Raudra, angry. It could be fearful, Vibhats. So the various forests that appear in the Ramayana, they acquire different names depending on the events that take place there. Let me give you an example. Chitrakoot is the retreat of Ram during exile. Dandakaranya is also a forest, which was the abode of the demons. And Ram traveled together with Lakshman and others, visiting the hermitages of the sages so that they could do their yajna and he would protect them from the attack of the demons. That was the Dandakaranya forest. Panchvati is the place of exile where Sita is kidnapped. Lanka is the evergreen lush forest where she is taken. And the Ashok Vatika, Ashok Vatika is supposed to be the sorrowless garden. The place is separated from the palace of the demon Ravan. Ashok Vatika was not inside his palace. It was separated from his palace. And she lives there during her captivity. And it is here that Hanuman will come along to see her and bring the message of comfort coming from her husband and people who will save her. But he is also linked to the forest of Kishkinda. Kishkinda is the forest where he met Ram for the first time. Hanuman, near the lake Pampa. Then there is the sacred forest of Mount Dronagiri, into which Hanuman had to fly in search of the Sanjeevani booty. So also interesting is the process of geographic localization of these mythical places that are gradually structured in the real geography of the subcontinent. So from the island of Sri Lanka to the Himalayas, along the sacred rivers, a universe comes to life. What kind of universe is this? A universe that is made up of lilies and lotuses and vines, known and other mysterious herbs, aquatic plants, shrubs, edible and inedible fruits. There is a whole catalogue that reaches a little beyond 100 to 200 names, not yet all precisely identified. So this abundance develops in different types of ecosystems that we could mainly define as tropical, dry or moist, deciduous forest, and to which are added evergreen jungles and Himalayan alpine landscapes in which the forest is as found in heaven. Whenever we think of Shiva, we think of the Himalayas, and whatever nature is there, the way it is manifested, they say it's heaven. A clear allusion to an ecosystem that is a metaphor for a journey of spiritual transcendence. Now, I hope you have an understanding, I hope that you people have an understanding of what I'm trying to come to in terms of when you're looking at the way ecology has been interwoven into our two important texts, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, and how it has relevance even today. So when you're looking at, and then looking at deep ecology, I'm building an argument for you to be interested in eco-critical studies of your own text and to keep looking at what levels you need to go into, rather than just looking at this little framework which the West seems to have developed, for which we really have taken a penchant because we think that's the way it operates the best, and not giving it a look from our own perspective, our own aesthetics, our own understanding, our own philosophy, our own way of life, and the way it manifests. So let me take you to the Khandava forest and the animal empathy. There's the enigma of the Khandava forest and the animal empathy. If you look at the poem Mahabharata, it has nearly 100,000 shlokas, as considered the largest epic ever composed in the history of mankind. And there are many who are not accustomed to matters of ideological nature. But the saga of Krishna, who was the avatar of Vishnu, the fellow Pandavas, and the many characters in the poem, all of us know it. So it's, it's a rather dense matter around the primitive core. Most scholars date this around the 4th century BC. And a great amount of heterogeneous narrative and doctrinal elements have been gradually added in the following centuries. So if we look at it from the point of view of a new eco-critical exegesis, the ecological material, the references to the environment and to the territory surrounding the main narrative plot about the great war fought between the Kauravas and the Pandavas, descendants of Bharat, it's so extensive and intense that it would require more than just a cursory discussion. Now, in the wealth of these literary elements, there is an episode that has recently become a central theme of difficult interpretation in environmental humanities in India. And this has happened in particular because it represents a dramatic event which, whose symbolism is still difficult to explain. Now, if you have read the Mahabharata, there is a fire of the Khandava forest. The Khandava forest was an ancient, lush, ancestral place running along the banks of the Yamuna river. In the epic, it is said that Krishna himself, together with Arjun, one of the heroes, he burnt it down, carrying out a great massacre of trees and vegetation and killing every form of life living in the forest. This is mentioned in the Mahabharata in the Adi Parvam section, chapters 214 to 25. Now, the region was identified by Indian scholars as more or less coinciding with the Delhi area, which is considered to have been built in the same place as Indraprasth, the capital of the Pandavas. So, if the destruction of the forest could be read as an extreme sacrifice, it's terrible, this sacrifice, but it was necessary for the construction of the future capital. The whole episode could be interpreted as a founding myth. But the theme of domestication of the territory, the comparison between the domesticated and the wild, is quite common in anthropology. It is reflected in many founding myths of the oral cycles of the indigenous peoples of India. Even in the Islamic world, particularly in the Mughal area, this motive is one of the most recurring ones in literature or in the marvelous medieval miniatures. The emperor is often portrayed at the head of his army, like on a horseback or an elephant, wading through rushing rivers, large hunts, where the natural element seems to be the main subject depicted. Look at any of the paintings, miniature paintings. These views symbolize the domestication of a wild territory, but also translates the political metaphor about the extension of the imperial prominence and authority in an indomitable region. So in the Mahabharata, the conquest of a territory, which theoretically in the literary tradition has its roots in the foundation of the ancient kingdom of India, the Mahajanapadas, would be transposed into the epic description of the forest fire. So this is the prerogative of a transformation of a wild and uncontrolled environment into an agro-pastoral land, which is in turn a prerequisite for the process of urbanization. So the next step involves a process of normalization, a re-establishment of equilibrium, that however is not free from remorse, as if this were the prerogative of a new ethical and moral value. Now the state of suffering in Sanskrit, the term is defined as shok. It's a word that translates a state of pain, understood it in its multiple meanings, obviously including physical and mental suffering. It will therefore be clear how the shadow line separating the suffering caused by an act of violence and the remorse that may ensue from it in literature can be very subtle. If you look at Indian doctrines, it will be very correct here to point out that Jainism and Buddhism, if you take it into consideration, shok is understood as a mixture of suffering and remorse. Shok is understood as a mixture of suffering and remorse. And that underlies the concept of non-violence or ahimsa. So if you look at Indian history, the first striking example of this, and probably the most banal, is that of Emperor Ashoka. Literally a soka, without suffering, who according to his famous edict on the rock of Dhauli, which is now in Kalinga in Odisha, if you go to Bhubaneswar you can see it, affirmed that after having massacred the people of the kingdom of Kalinga, he would have been seized with deep remorse and would have therefore embraced ahimsa or non-violence by converting to becoming a Buddhist. So this is an element returning in a differently complex way in the history of Indian philosophy. There are several thinkers who draw on this theme and they rework it as a way of spiritual redemption. Thapar talks about this, one of the critics writes about this. Another classic example is Mahatma Gandhi and his followers. For the moment, however, it is, how they adopted ahimsa. The theme of ahimsa is important, not only as a non-violent attitude, but also as a feeling of compassion. Now, going back to the epic, it is possible to give infinite examples of this. And so, if you look at the Ramayana and the Balakand, the Sanskrit epic is attributed to the poet Valmiki. There is a key event in which the author witnesses the unnecessary killing. And I talked to you about this. A male bird is killed by a hunter. The female, it is said, she raised a poignant cry of pain and Valmiki heard it. And the bird was covered in blood and the female bird was crying. Upon seeing this injustice, Valmiki so angered that he cursed the hunter. And cursed the hunter for eternity, interrupting the poor animal's passion. And the two birds called Kronakas have been identified with the noble Indian Saras crane. You know the Saras bird. So they say that it was the Saras bird which was affected by it. Now there is a clear metaphor for the protagonists of the epic, Sita and Ram, here, because they will be separated because of the events narrated. You'll find that separation and the shok will be constantly there. So then now coming to erotic passion. Erotic passion is a rasa. It's an essence. That is a profound emotion, which is very characteristic of the canons of aesthetics in Indian art. You will see a very clear allusion to a spiritual way of salvation. Now, these issues have long been discussed in the literature, but today there seems to be a greater emphasis on the compassion of Valmiki and how he exhibits it towards animals. A fairly intelligible undercurrent element of this episode. It clearly indicates that personal empathy with wild animals in general is a virtuous quality. It's a virtue. And this is the same concept which is found in the Khandava forest episode. The numerous references in large part of the Hindu sacred scriptures of man and animal, God and animal, and the metamorphosis from God to animal. There are so many. Or even of sages and seers disguised as animals. You have the Narsinga avatar. You have so many references that you can have there, where the non-human animal world shares human emotions. So, the attitude of the early Buddhists in the exploration of animal behavior is equally interesting. And in the Pali Canon, it is customary to start such a discussion by emphasizing the fundamental importance of friendship, mitta, and compassion, karuna, towards animals. So you have to take animals as friends and have compassion for them. And this is an extremely interesting area and aspect, because it shows up and shows us that the theme of multi-species relations, much discussed today, multi-species relation, वो ecology में पढ़ाते हैं. There is a cycle in which each is interdependent on the other. हमारे टेक्स्ट में तो ये पहले से है. This multi-species relations, which is being picked up by environmental humanities and anthropologies, can also be investigated effectively through the lens of eco-criticism if you look at Hindu literature. Then there is also, we still have 5 minutes, there is also the concept of time in India. And we have the concept of the yuga. I'm not going to go into that because I do not have more time. If I had more time, I would have discussed that. But that's another area that needs to be looked at and to be understood. There is this whole question which is posed. Is the Kali Yuga the Anthropocene? Is this the age? Satyuga, men of the golden age, ancient beings. Second stage, Aya Treta Yuga. Humanity enters a period of decline. Then the Dwapar Yuga, the third stage, which is very interesting for the purpose of our study, because you talk of violence in Dwapar. And then the darkest period in India is considered the fourth and the one in which we are living, which is the Kali Yuga, and the subsequent age of iron or the current humanity. So our age is described as gloomy, as an era in which not only violence is rampant, but in which ignorance, stupidity, and an abandonment of all that is sacred, all that is valuable, that would determine our tragic overturning of customs and values. So according to Indian thought, the period in which we live is therefore the one in which the history of humanity enters a perverse curve of decay and regression. Because according to our thought, this is the last of the four ages in which humanity has developed its possibilities. Kali Yuga is representing, and in many thousands, it has many hundreds of years to go still. But it represents the final segment of this cycle. And as a kind of free fall, time is imagined accelerating, rapidly degenerating. Customs are corrupted with great rapidity. Look around you, reaching a climax, coinciding with the final dissolution, which we call Mahapralay. What in the West would coincide with the end of times, or eschaton, or the end of times. So in environmental humanities, there is a certain emphasis in noting that the succession of cosmic eras, that, all this is kind of linked. Indian literature is completely replete with multiple references to the end of times, or Pralay, the warning signs and all that. And for that, we need to go into other details, which I wouldn't like to go into today because we have very little time. We could have done that, but had we had 2 periods. But I would like to, after having said this to you, tell you that the deep ecology proposes that there should be a shift from anthropocentrism to ecocentrism, where the world and all living and non-living things are at the center of things. And I would like to conclude, because we are all teachers of English literature, something that Thoreau once wrote, and which embodies what we are trying to do today in this talk is, and I quote him, Thoreau writes, "There can be no history but natural history. If one believes that by nature we mean the human as well as the non-human world, then that is the truth." Thank you. Questions?